Lisa Rubel from Quilty Zest, and today I'm going to show you how to turn a bunch of cute flannel fabric into a fringed flannel baby quilt. This is a process where you kind of quilt as you go, so the back and the front get made at the same time, and when you have it all sewn together, it's done. No machine quilting, no binding necessary. It's a quick and easy way to make a sweet flannel quilt. Now today I'm using the Doodle Baby Flannel Collection by Jessica Flick from Benertex Fabrics. These are really cute fabrics with a lot of whimsical little hand-drawn animals, done in light grays, light blues, yellow, sea green, and a little bit of purple. So I had a lot of fun choosing which fabrics I was going to use for my quilt. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the steps to make a flannel fringe quilt out of the Doodle Baby fabrics that I'm using. You can also go to my blog and you'll find the link below, or go to quiltyzest.com, and you'll find step-by-step written out instructions with photos that will walk you through the process as well. And if you don't catch some of the measurements or layout instructions in the video, you can always go back and find that information at quiltyzest.com. So I chose some of the bigger prints here for the larger squares, and then I have 2 white prints and 2 gray prints for the 4 patches. And my larger squares are cut at 9 inches, and my smaller squares are cut at 5 inches because we're going to be using a 1/2 inch seam allowance to make that fringed edge that will show. So when I cut these, because typically when you get fabric it's already folded in half, I cut my squares with the fabric still folded, and I kept the fabrics together. So I've got flannel facing out on both sides, and by doing that you don't have to go back and match up squares. They're just all pre-matched for you. So each of the squares that you see here is actually a stack of 2 fabrics, so they're all ready to be stitched. So the first thing we're going to do is stitch across each square, both the small ones and the large ones, on a diagonal in both directions, and that will sort of serve as our quilting to hold those 2 layers together. Now when I do this, I like to chain piece because it is a lot faster than just sewing one at a time. So I will take my entire stack of squares over to the sewing machine and just run them all through on the diagonal in one direction, and then cut them apart and do the same thing in the other direction. So for marking the line, you have a couple choices. You can use a ruler and a fabric marking pen, or I've got a chalk pencil here, and you can just draw a line corner to corner in both directions. You can do that on all your squares and then just stitch on that line. Make sure it is a marking pen that will disappear though from your fabric when you either wet it or iron it. The other option, which I have started using and I really like, is I have a Vivolux laser here, and so it's velcroed to the side of my sewing machine. So with this laser, I line it up so the laser line is aligned with my needle. And then without having to mark the square, I start in one corner and I make sure that the laser line is coming to the other corner. And I just stitch on that line all the way across. No marking needed. It's a fantastic shortcut. So once all of your small squares have X's stitched across them, which connects 2 right or wrong side together squares, we're going to sew them together in 4 patches. So I'm going to arrange mine so I've got the gray kitty corner and the white kitty corner. Now instead of sewing so the seam is on the back, we're going to sew so the seam is on the front, and we're going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance to give us extra room for that fringe. So I'm going to lay these 2 right sides together and stitch again with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and for this one as well. So now I've got my 2 patches. What I'm going to do is, for the moment, press this my seam allowance is open. Just finger pressing is fine, and if you know your seam allowance is not perfect, it's not a big deal because this is all going to be fringed. So I'm going to put my 2 patches wrong sides, so the sides without the seams showing, or seam allowances showing together, and I'm going to pin in the middle where the seams join and add in a couple more. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to stitch down this line with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And here is what my 4-patch block looks like. Doesn't look like much right now because the fabric seams are just sort of sticking up. But I'm going to make 15 of these, and then I will have 15 of my large squares, and I'm going to put them together into a quilt. So when I put these together, I'm going to make sure I do them all in the same orientation, because that's going to give me sort of a almost like an Irish chain look, with the grays that will go in diagonal lines and the whites that will go in diagonal lines. So I'm going to sew all of these, and then we'll look at quilt assembly. So once you have all of your 4 patches made, then it's time for the quilt layout. We've got the larger squares that are quilted across in both directions, as well as the 4 patches. And so each row is going to alternate larger squares and 4 patches. And if you head over to my blog, you can see some of what the layout option that I did, but you're going to alternate in each row. So once you have your layout decided, you're going to sew the squares together, and you're going to sew them same as before when we did the 4 patches, with the back of the quilt together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and sew into rows, and then join the rows to complete your quilt. So I'm assembling my first row, and my first row is going to be 4 patch, square, 4 patch, square, 4 patch. So I'm going to take my first 2 pieces, my first 2 squares, and put them back sides together and put a couple pins in. And you want to make sure that your exposed seam allowances here are pressed out to the sides. I just finger press them, and then I keep an eye on them as I am stitching, because if they get bent over, it'll just be really bulky. So I'm going to sew the first 2 together, and then these are the next 2. I'm going to do the same here, and then I'll join these pairs together and add on the last square. Now these don't have to be perfect, because you'll be cutting fringe with the seam allowances, so if they're not exactly the same size, don't worry about it. So just like for the 4 patches, I'm going to sew down here using a 1/2 inch seam allowance for each one. So I've got 2 sets of squares sewn together in pairs, and now I'm going to join those together. Again, making sure that this is my seam allowance in the middle is pressed open. And so this first row has 5 blocks in it, and we'll have 6 rows that each have 5 blocks. So I've got this, and that's 4, and then I'm going to just go down to the end and pin this one on. And you'll notice that all of my 4 patches are aligned in the same way, and that way I'll have the grays crisscrossing in one direction and the white prints in the other. So here's my row 1, and I'm going to make 3 rows that look like this, and then 3 rows that will have 3 of the squares and just 2 of the 4 patches. And then I'll sew those rows together, alternating to complete my quilt. So when you've got your whole quilt assembled, it'll look something like this. You can see I've got all 6 rows of 5 blocks each put together. So one more thing I wanted to show you with this assembled quilt, because I used the same squares front and back when I made my little sandwiches. If you see this quilt, this is the front that will ultimately be fringed. And then if you turn it around, it actually has the same pattern on the back, because it's all the same fabric. So it is a 2-sided quilt for sure, and a quilt that doesn't involve quilting or binding. So like I said, except for cutting the fringe, it goes together pretty quickly. And our final step will be clipping all of the edges to create the fringe. But before we do that, there's one last thing you need to do. And that is, you need to stitch around the entire outside of the quilt with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And by doing that way when you go to clip, you've got a line to go to, but also this keeps the outer edges of all of these doubled up squares secure together so that they are not flopping. And so I just went all the way around. At 3 of the corners I pivoted, and then at the fourth corner where I started and stopped, I started off the fabric, went on, back stitched, and then did the same at the end just to secure it. But I just stitched all the way around, again, roughly a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And so now is the time for the cutting. And what you want to do, and I've done it with both a larger scissors and with a smaller scissors, and just see what works for you. What you want to do is cut just little fringes. The closer together you get, the more fringe-like it will be, but make sure you do not cut through any stitching lines. And again, you see what works better for you, a small or a large scissors. Sometimes I kind of trade off because my hand gets tired from one or the other, but you're going to cut all of your visible seams. So in the blocks themselves, you're going to cut these as well. What you can do, what I do to kind of help speed things along, is when I get to a spot like in these 4 patches where there's a seam on each side, but they're both stitched down, is if you cut at the end near where it's stitched down, then you can fold them together and cut through both sides at once. Again, always making sure that you are not cutting through that stitch line. And if you do, you'll want to go back and repair that. But cutting all of the fringe. So here's another section where they're overlapped, but they're both folded back down. So I'm going to cut at both ends of this section and fold those 2 up. Didn't quite get through this. Fold these 2 up. Instead of having them be separate, fold them together, and then I can cut along there. This cutting is probably the most time-intensive part of making this whole quilt, but it's worth it for the wonderful texture it creates. So after you're done with all of that cutting on the quilt, all the way around the outside and every single seam line in the quilt, what you're going to want to do is throw it in the wash, and then the dryer, of course, and that will help those edges to fray and create that wonderful fringy feel. If you don't feel like it frayed enough, you can definitely wash it right away a second time. Otherwise, just as it gets washed with use, it will continue to fray and fray. And that is your finished quilt. So I've got the whole quilt fringed up. You can see I clipped all the edges and all the seams in the 4 patches and between the blocks. And so our very last step is to throw this in the washing machine. Give it a good wash and then a dry, and that will turn those fringed edges a little bit frayed. And like I said, you can do it a second time as well if you want to add a little more fraying to the fringe, and then your baby quilt will be done. So here's a close-up of all of the fringe that was cut. And here's my quilt, fresh out of the washer and dryer with all kinds of fantastic frayed fringe. Look at all that texture. This is just from 1 wash and 1 dry. It's got some pretty great frayed edges. I hope you enjoyed my tutorial and make one of your own. So I just want to say thank you to Benertex for the Doodle baby fabric that I used to make this baby quilt as part of the Benertex Ambassador program. And make sure to head over to my website, quiltyzest.com, to see what other quilts I'm working on and to find other tutorials that I've done.